beliefs are self-fulfilling. And this is also very critical to our understanding to help us with our discussion today. There is a creative medium in our belief systems, or that is subject to our belief system. And what we believe tends to externalize, as was stated in the New Testament, as you have believed, so be it done unto you. Pretty much hitting it right on the head. And this is a cognitive-oriented understanding of how all this works, and indeed the problem is that beliefs are very insidious. They are deeply rooted, better put it that way. And there are some good beliefs, helpful belief systems, and some that are devastating, that really do not allow us to survive. The nocebo effect is very, very powerful. That is the belief that a pessimism, when overly pessimistic, can be very harmful to us. So, mindfulness meditation, when the mind is steady, stilled, what happens is that we begin to decenter. We stop the personalizing process. That was the process where the child asks, what is it about me that has led this to occur? That process of personalizing begins to reduce as, well, of course, we do not practice meditation as youngsters generally. However, hopefully we have the capacity to enter that state, take the training, and get the idea, and then give up ideas. That's the process. We turn ourselves back over to a kind of a naive or less predisposed perspective, and actually new information begins to come into our lives. We find that we are in fact supplied, that life does supply us, and we also find out that that we have been personalizing negative ideas, and that is resulting in our frustrations and in the reenactment of those early events that drew us to the conclusion that our life was a life to be suffered. Now, however, we do want to just mention very quickly, certainly an important point, that with full revelation, we do actually recognize that life is suffering. However, we do not necessarily need to be suffering with life, and this is a bit of a opening the box here for a larger conversation. However, we're going to just mention that at this point because no one is getting away from suffering. We are really in a conversation about psychological suffering. Okay, and so we see that in mindfulness meditation, the person is doing two things. That is providing for psychological distance. So in other words, the ideas, the memory of what you believed is still there. However, we are not reacting to it. It is not driving behavior. For example, a woman described to me her understanding of mindfulness meditation. She suggested to me that she had practiced with her girlfriend, and I asked her for an example, and she was saying she was waiting for a train one day, very anxious and in a rush, and as the train came into the station, she refused to get up. And she let that train go, and she let the next one go too, until she calmed down. Well, that is certainly what mindfulness does. It does not cooperate with the signals that the mind is giving it. It is indeed a rebellion, if you will, against the mind, that very same mind that provides for our survival, and a very critical understanding. Folks, when we are now psychologically wounded, our problem is now the mind. Our problem is now self-conception, it is worldview, it is the value system, the knowledge base, and the memories that's keeping us in a life trap, if you will. So, let's bring into the conversation the the psychedelic experience. I do have some experience, quite a couple of years back, and as a youngster in the early 1970s, I did have exposure to LSD, and I encountered something that I had not anticipated. And just one of those things. Very profound event in that it happened in a particular time, and it does have a lot to do with liberation. And what it is that Cesar, that's me, was sort of moved out of the way. So Cesar is concepts, they are schemas that provide for the survival of the organism. So under the influence of LSD, that value system that is organized towards survival, very important of course, is modified. And there is indeed an element of getting out of the way. However, what remains is our extraordinary intellect. Our intellect is really directed by our current value system. And once that value system is modified, the intellect will roam in considerations that were, well, unanticipated. For example, looking at what we call reality, looking at what we call time. And even as a youngster, I probably maybe 20 years old, I apprehended timelessness, and quite a surprise. And now this timelessness is really not a time-bound experience, if you will. It does not have to do with time. It is the absence of time, and it is eternity. It is an eternity without a beginning, and an idea that really I had not in any sense pondered up until that time. It did foretell to some extent of the person that was going to come along, the person you're listening to, as timelessness is important, that we begin to understand that that remaining present, for example, is helpful, and that these flights into the past and projections into the future are actually occurring in an eternal present, or if you will, in an eternity that has more to do with nature itself, perhaps with the spirit of life itself, reflecting on itself, than it has to do with us. So much of our lives, folks, is nature itself. In other words, you do not know how you are hearing me right now. I know that you have been hearing all your life, you don't really know how it occurs. Certainly, some of us are trained as doctors and medical people, and we get an idea of some of the systems involved there. However, we do not know how it actually occurs. We cannot do it ourselves, and we cannot see, we cannot breathe, we don't know how we move, we don't know how we breathe. The law of life, falling in love, going to sleep, going to the toilet, eating, all these things that we tend to identify as something that we are doing is in fact nature occurring. And we need to give some consideration to the possibility that also our thoughts, which are so much identified as our own, are in fact other natural events that are not necessarily personal. So I do want to point to the fact that personalizing itself is not necessarily personal, that it may, this mechanism may well be just another manifestation of the nature that we are participating in. It is, this nature is indivisible. It requires wholeness. In other words, one thing is dependent on another. So we start getting ideas, even though we sort of feel that we are individuals in a reality. We are in fact the reality itself. Some of the great thinkers and saints have apprehended this. Some of the statements made, for example, is what you're looking at is what is looking. These models help us to undermine the personalizing process and liberate us by degree from our psychological suffering. So I was talking about the LSD experience. There are now there is a research resumed with LSD and psilocybin as well, and some of the what I've read about recently in LSD, they've been providing it to folks who are in the dying process, and indeed it seems to benefit existential fear of death, and with a single dose, for example, that some folks have reported that they have lost their fear of death. And I think that this is just one small example of the profound shift that can occur under the influence of a psychedelic. I fully recognize also, of course, that that research is illegal in America today, and certainly not encouraging any illegal activity. However, we do want to take a look at the circumstances as they are. There is indeed research with psilocybin also. This is a botanical based, it's a mushroom based psychedelic substance, and if I may, I mean some folks may disagree with me about this. It is certainly does not seem to be as what we would call strong as LSD. In other words, the effects of it are actually more manageable and maybe usable in therapeutic approaches, because the person is not really in that much of a different place. So here's the common factor. The common factors with psychedelic therapies and the mindfulness approaches, and there are no doubt distinctions, just pointing at these particular two factors, which Aaron Beck, one of the fathers of cognitive therapy, one of the innovators of cognitive behavioral therapy, discussed the decentering process, which is not taking things personally, and the psychological distance. And I believe that both therapeutic approaches provide for this, and the results can be highly beneficial. There is, of course, a problem about habitual use or the abuse of any substance. And, discussing substances from a harm reduction perspective, which I assume